their job?
So basically they're acting as a fiduciary of the estate. So that means that they're responsible for making sure that everybody who has a potential interest in the estate and those assets has notice, and that's proper notice based on what the court requires in your jurisdiction. They also typically need to file an inventory or statement of accounts. So basically that's telling the court what assets there are that need to be distributed. They also typically file income and inheritance and estate taxes with the federal or state government. Although for most of us, fortunately or unfortunately, if your estate is under about $25 million, you typically don't owe much in the way of federal or state taxes. But again, that depends on your state and obviously the financial situation. Sometimes you have to notify who's called the Commissioner of Accounts, which is basically the accounting department of the probate office, for lack of a better term, to make sure that everybody is on notice there about the assets and the distribution. You have to pay probate taxes to the clerk of the court. You have to pay, fees to the clerk of the court for the process, and you have to pay any debts of the estate. And often that's something that's surprising to people because sometimes they don't know the debts that their parents might have. And then after you do all that stuff, and while you're doing all that stuff, you have to disperse the assets of the estate. So that means that if you're selling a house or a car, you have to deal with DMV if there's a car, and with title companies and buyers if you're dealing with a piece of real property. And then you have to make sure that everybody who's supposed to sign off on a transaction actually signs it. So sometimes it's sort of like herding cats if you're dealing with people in multiple states, or, God forbid, people who disagree.
I've had more of those than I care to think about. So,
me too.
It's true. They just, somebody wants, it's like they bring all their emotional baggage from childhood with them. The old mom always liked you best. Why should I cooperate kind of thing. It's crazy. It's crazy.
Yeah. So it's definitely, it can be a lot of work, and unfortunately a lot of times it's unpaid work, but it's necessary. And hopefully parents have put things in good enough order that it's relatively easy during such a stressful time for the children to move forward and do this.
Yeah, so there's I know when you sell a property, it's in Virginia, it's a year and a day before you can collect any proceeds unless you post a surety bond, and that runs in Virginia. It's about $2 a thousand for the sales price, and that way you can get the money right away instead of having to wait. So just as an alert to children who may be on the greedy side and want their money right away, that doesn't always necessarily happen unless you post that surety bond. So you want to talk a minute about that?
Absolutely. And it's a good idea for the children to consider their own tax situation in the midst of all that too, because sometimes it might benefit you to wait a little bit longer and maybe collect your distribution, your inheritance, in the following tax year. Because remember, just because you don't owe taxes on behalf of the estate, you're still taxed as an individual on that new asset and that income.
Exactly. And that's something, I had a son once, his parents passed, and he wanted to sell the house right away. And I said, well, has it been through probate? Well, what's that? When I said, okay, start at the first number one situation, and it took him, he just didn't want to believe that he had to do anything legally. He just was going to sell the house. And I said, oh, that'll be interesting. Bye. I wasn't going to do that. I didn't need the headache, but that it's just, there are certain things you have to do. You don't get to make the rules, and that's just the way it is. So the step-by-step, let's try to give some clarity to that. How does a child find out that their parent passed away? Let's say they live in one state and the parent hasn't been good as far as keeping in touch, or they've moved, or an accident has happened and the police have to notify. How do you find out that your parent has died or is in the hospital and may not survive? How do you establish emergency contact information for that parent?
So it's definitely a good idea to be, hopefully be in touch with your parents and make sure that you are an emergency point of contact with, doctors and insurance providers and all of that. But if you're out of state, sometimes it comes down to, the police or the doctors or whomever have to actually find you. And it's figuring out who the children are and talking to friends and family and neighbors and tracking you down. And especially if the heirs are distant or if the children are out of touch, sometimes that can be very difficult and time-consuming in and of itself. And nothing can really move forward until that next of kin is notified and then allowed to move forward.
Right, exactly. And then the whoever is the person as the executor has to notify Social Security and all the steps, like insurance company. If there's a beneficiary, then who would get the money and proving it and having the death certificate to show those kinds of things. Talk a little bit about, we're slow on time here, and I want to make sure we get some horror stories so that the children listening will probably take this to heart and say, hey, I didn't realize that could happen. Isn't that a mess? And we're trying to help them avoid messes. So talk a little bit about some of your horror stories, because I think they're always interesting.
Absolutely. So at the outset, let me say the easiest way to avoid this, aside from having a will, is also being very careful about how you title your assets. So if you have, for example, a life insurance policy, make sure that there's not just a beneficiary listed, but also alternative beneficiaries if that primary beneficiary has passed away. So you can do that with bank accounts, 401ks, all those various accounts, and you can even do it with your real estate. So this file actually closed just a few weeks ago, and this was a horror story. It definitely gave me some heartburn for a few weeks. Basically, this woman bought a property in the 1980s. She was married at the time, but the property was just in her name. She had 2 children of this marriage, and her husband and she split up. They divorced. She got remarried to her new husband, who's been her husband for about 10, 15 years. She passed away a few months ago. She never added him to the title of her house. So she didn't have a will. So that means she's married at the time she passed away, and plus she has 2 children from a prior marriage. So that means all 3 of them, under Virginia law, and I believe almost every state, has a claim to some portion of her assets. It's just a matter of what percentage. So stepdad, her husband, contacts the daughters and says, look, I know that you're entitled to some of Mom's estate. I'm going to give you a few $1,000s. They agreed to an amount for each child. And then you're going to say, I'm not owed anything further, and I get the rest. So everybody is relatively happy with this situation, even though maybe the daughters don't like stepdad, and maybe the stepdad only likes one of the 2 daughters. But he split up the assets between them, and it pretty much came out to what the state would require him to do anyway. So he had them sign basically a contract saying they wouldn't make any further claims. The problem is the daughters never signed a deed, and they were true legal owners along with stepdad to the house because they all were inheriting under Mom's estate. So he puts the property on the market, gets a contract, then we pull the title search and say, okay, well, 2 daughters plus stepdad need to sign off. Well, it turns out stepdaughter number 1 said, I'm not dealing with this. I have my money. I signed a contract. I'm not signing anything else. So what happens? She decided to be a little bit stubborn. We missed the closing date. The attorney that had prepared the original contract for those daughters to sign and didn't have the deed done ended up actually having to sue her to, let's say, encourage her to cooperate. And about a week and a half later, the 2 daughters decided that they would actually convey their interest so that Dad could sell the house.
Phew.
Yeah. So please don't let that happen to you, listeners.
Oh, no. I have a trust, and I've set it up so that there is none of this issue, and I even put something in. I told a friend of mine that I had put something in my trust that if my children argue with each other, nobody gets anything. So
I love that.
I'm not putting up with it. You get along and you take the money and you whatever. But I don't like any issues at the end. I mean, I'm gone. I'm not around to be a referee. So if you all get in an argument, neither one of you gets any of it. So, at any rate, unfortunately, we have to wrap it up. This has been the fastest 30 minutes I've ever done a show, and I really appreciate your coming on the show, and I think I'm going to have you back again so we can do part 2, but this gives the adult children a chance to think about stuff, and I think we probably should do a show on step-by-step going through, what do you need from your parents, and step-by-step organizing so that it's kind of like a document that you can keep and refer to. Now, yeah, it'll change over time if your parents don't die for another, 5 or 10, 15 years. But getting things like passwords and writing that down so you know how to access things on their computer, you know how to where things are if they have an iPhone or a phone of some sort, where things are stored. That's so important and can really help if you have a step-by-step linear approach to whatever. And I think knowing what questions to even ask your parents and getting the parents to sit down with you and saying, okay, here's what it is. And a lot of, if a husband passes before the wife does, and the wife is left with, she doesn't know who the financial advisor is, she doesn't have any account information, she doesn't know the passwords on his computer, it can be extremely frustrating. So I think getting the passwords to things is super important, just because it's like you're dumping your brain onto paper and telling your surviving people around you, here's my life on paper, everything you need to know. And I think that's worth a whole separate program, but I do appreciate your coming today because you have really gotten the ball rolling for a lot of adult children who really don't know where to start.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. Such an important topic. I'm thrilled to be part of it.
I am so glad, and I will definitely have you back again. We will pick up where we left off, Jessica. And would you quickly tell people your website or email address where they could contact you if they have more questions? I know they can contact me at moveorimprovewithdebbie@gmail.com, but how can they get in touch with you?
Absolutely. So if you go to our website, championtitle.com, our contact numbers are on there. I'm in the Fairfax office, but if you call the main number and ask for Jessica Youngs, they'll connect you with me. And feel free to send me an email as well. My email is jessicay@KASE, so it's case with a K, lawyers with an S.com.
Awesome. And thank you so much, Jessica. And I look forward to having you back again to pick up where we leave off. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Debbie. Bye-bye.